Review from St. Mary's College of Maryland, a public liberal arts college about 2 hours south of Washington, D.C. My name is Katie Arnett, and I'm pleased to talk to you today about a case study I recently published in the Canadian Modern Language Review entitled Scaffolding Inclusion in a Grade A Core French Classroom, an Exploratory Case Study. Before I talk to you a little bit today about the research study, I want to give you a little bit more background about myself. I'm beginning my 7th year at St. Mary's College of Maryland in the Department of Educational Studies. I teach graduate and undergraduate courses implicated in education, focusing on issues related to special education, English language learners, and secondary methods of instruction. Prior to beginning this position, I was a high school French teacher in a suburb of Baltimore County, Maryland. My connection to Canada began as a graduate student when I was enrolled at Boise UT for both my master's and doctoral work. It was during my doctorate that I collected the data that were featured in the article published in the CMLR. I still remain connected to the FSL community in Canada, even though that I'm no longer a part of the FSL community here as a classroom teacher. I'm in Canada several times a year presenting at scholarly and professional conferences, and I also collaborate with colleagues in other parts of Canada to work on new research related to FSL education. So hopefully you'll be seeing more of my work in years to come. As I said earlier, I collected the data featured in the study in the CMLR several years ago when I was a doctoral candidate. Sometimes there exists a lag between the publication date of research and the actual data collection, some because of the logistics of getting articles published, but in my case for this particular article is that my work as a classroom teacher kept reintroducing me to ideas that I could use to analyze the data. So in the way that I presented the article in the CMLR is actually different than how I presented the data in my doctoral dissertation because of the experiences I had as a classroom teacher and how they informed my thinking about working with students with diverse learning needs in FSL settings. To recruit participants for my research study, I went through several steps. First, I received the ethical review clearance of the University of Toronto that was required as it was research conducted with humans. Then I contacted a school board in the Ontario area and I asked permission for them to conduct the research study. The research study underwent a second ethical review with them, and upon receiving their clearance, we began the participant recruitment process. The school board contacted principals of intermediate schools in the school board, letting them know that my research study had been approved and that I was seeking participants. The principals were asked to share with their core French teachers my invitation to participate, and should the teachers be interested in the study, they were to contact me directly. So I could not directly work with the school principals or the teachers to recruit for the study. I initially had 3 teachers express interest in the research study, but as the dates approached and even as the study began, my participant pool dropped to 1, which made it a case study. As was the case when I began my research, and even the case now, there actually isn't a lot of data out there about the experience of supporting students with diverse learning needs in FSL contexts. There have been a lot of research studies or empirical philosophical papers that have questioned whether students with diverse learning needs belong in FSL settings, but very few research studies focusing on what is happening in classrooms when there are diverse learning needs present. So with that reality in mind, that influenced the design of my study. I knew I needed to be a bit more descriptive in my methodology so that I could start to capture the phenomena that were happening. You can't really test phenomena and look at the impact of treatments until we understand what phenomena are happening. With that said, I used several tools to help me paint the picture of this particular grade A core French classroom. I used an observation checklist that I had designed for a previous research study that was an adaptation of tools already out there for second language researchers, but it was a hybrid with materials that were developed for teachers interested in special education and identifying levels of support for students with special needs. This was an instrument that I piloted prior to the implementation of this study and developed inter-rater reliability with to ensure that the measure was reliable and valid and that my coding practices were pretty consistent. I also used teacher interviews. I interviewed my participant Julie, and that's not her real name, prior to the observation period and after the observation period. My interview prior to the observation period was designed to know a little bit more about her. What were her educational experiences? What did she believe about working in the FSL context? And things that she could tell me about herself that might influence me and might help me better understand her actions in the classroom that I was about to observe. Following the observation period, which lasted a little over 2 months, I talked to her a little bit more, asking her about specific events that happened in the classroom, trying to get her point of view on things that I witnessed. When she did a certain kind of activity, I would ask her for additional information. Well, why did you do this? Why do you think it worked? I was working with just one of her grade 8 core French classrooms, and this classroom had 29 students. It was a classroom that had a lot of diversity, in part because it was an area of Canada where there was a lot of newcomer students, so there were many students in the class who spoke English as an additional language, and there were several students who were actively receiving or in the process of being tested for formal special education support. I interviewed 7 of the students in her classroom during the research study, individually and later as a group. My goal in interviewing the students was to understand their perspectives about her core French classroom and what they viewed as effective and supportive in her teaching style. To collect the observation data, I sat in an unobtrusive part of Julie's classroom. As she taught, I used the observation checklist to keep track of which strategies and resources she used to make her teaching more accessible to diverse learner needs. At the end of the observation period and the data collection period in general, I went about analyzing my data. For the observation data, I looked at frequencies to determine how often certain strategies appeared. For the interviews, I looked to find trends that emerged in the ideas that were shared within the individual student interviews and across the focus group interview with the students. The interviews with Julie served to help contextualize the descriptions I would write about of the periods that I observed in the classroom. In terms of findings for the research study, this is again where the influence I had of being a classroom teacher at the time influenced my thinking about the research. In looking at the data again with fresh eyes, I saw that Julie's approach to inclusive teaching was very proactive. She used what we call generative inclusion, meaning that from the start she planned her teaching so as to accommodate as many needs as possible. We're starting to also term this idea universal design for learning now. This was not necessarily what I had thought heading into the study, so it was interesting to see this emerge from the data. In terms of the adaptation strategies she used, I saw them being divided into 2 categories. Strategies that were used to help support students as they worked to understand the language that was presented to them, and then working to help the students build meaning in the languages they were communicating to each other and back to Julie. I talk about some of these strategies in detail in the study, focusing on those that were most dominant in her pedagogy. Some of the things that she used include sentence frames to help students know how to structure responses or start responses to questions. She would use slow, clear language with frequent repetitions to help students understand key points that she was trying to ask of them in the classroom. She had a lot of visual resources made available to the students to understand language and to remind them of language concepts. Julie's classroom also promoted an atmosphere of collaboration. Students were always encouraged to talk to neighbors to ask for clarification about work that was happening, and also to be able to problem solve in tasks. You could definitely see this collaborative spirit come through in the students when I talk to them about Julie's classroom. I report on those results in a study that was published in 2008 in the Canadian Journal of Applied Linguistics. As I was saying earlier, because it was a case study, I can't necessarily generalize the findings to all classroom contexts. However, as you heard me list some of the strategies that Julie used, and maybe that you read about in the article in greater detail, these strategies are known to all of us as FSL teachers. And even now, though I no longer teach FSL, I find myself using many of these strategies when I'm working with my students, even now adult learners who are planning to become teachers. So there is value in thinking about the strategies that were found to be part of the inclusive classroom environment in this particular case study, and thinking about how they may already be apparent in our classroom teaching, or how these strategies could be introduced in ways that could support students. I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about my research project, and I look forward to further discussions with you about research in FSL. Thank you.